There's nothing more versatile than a roll of duct tape. But really though, that glorious shiny gray tape is great to have in those moments when you need a quick fix for broken items, holes that need patching, home repairs, and just about anything else. Let me tell you, duct tape came in handy when I knocked the mirror off the passenger side of my car. Just wrapped it around and put a bunch of strips of tape and held it together. But even though duct tape has a bajillion uses, it should never be used in the way Robert Leroy Anderson did when he slaughtered 2 innocent women in Sioux Falls. This is the story of Robert, aka the duct tape killer. So this dude Robert was kind of like Ted Bundy. He was a 20-something-year-old man known for putting up this front that he was charming, suave dude, but on the inside, he was busy plotting attacks on unsuspecting young women. Robert spent quite some time studying and hunting all the women in the area until he knocked out his first official victim, Larissa. So Larissa was originally from Ukraine, but she immigrated to South Dakota with her husband and their 2 kids. Alright, so Larissa and Bill moved to the US in 1991. At the time, Larissa was 29. She and her husband both started working for the John Morrell & Co. meatpacking plant. Bill eventually found another job, but Larissa stayed at the company where she most regularly worked at night. During her time at the plant, she became friends with the maintenance guy, Robert Leroy Anderson. Dun dun dun. Well, little did Larissa know, but Robert and his friend Glenn had this whole big fantasy of abducting women and slaying them just to see what it felt like. So Robert knew Larissa was the perfect target to kickstart his slaying spree. He and Glenn brainstormed their whole plan of attack, and over the course of several months, Robert got all buddy-buddy with Larissa so he could stalk her. The plan of attack was to put wheel poppers in the road to damage Larissa's tires, and when she stopped to fix her flat tire, Robert and Glenn would snatch her up. And the demented duo set out to do just that. They got their trap in place and waited for Larissa to stop. But this wasn't Larissa's first flat tire, and she wasn't dumb enough to stop in the middle of nowhere by herself to get out and fix it. At this point, Larissa didn't fall for the trap, so Robert and Glenn had to brainstorm another way to abduct this woman. One August day in 1994, Larissa just finished a super long overnight shift and was headed to her car. But before she made it there, Robert approached Larissa, held a blade up to her, and told her to get in his car. Now, Larissa was smart, but there really wasn't a way out of this one since the dude had a shank, so she complied. Once Larissa got in the car, Robert and Glenn drove her to Lake Vermilion. Oh, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but Larissa was 6 weeks pregnant when all this went down. So not only are these doing terrible things to an innocent woman, they're doing them to an innocent pregnant woman, which makes it 10 times worse. Later, we find out that Robert used duct tape to stop Larissa's airflow before burying her under a choke cherry tree. And I can't decide whether the type of tree he buried her under was planned or a terrible coincidence, but either way, what happened to Larissa was just plain bad. When Larissa didn't come home from work that day, her husband obviously got concerned and contacted the police. And the investigators didn't really have leads or pieces of evidence, so nothing happened in Larissa's case until Robert went after his next victim, Piper. So Piper was a charming little Texas gal who went to Bible college in Oregon where she met her future husband, Vance. In 1988, Piper and Vance got married and moved to a rural town near Sioux Falls where they lived in a trailer on a 40-acre piece of land. Vance and Piper ended up having 2 kids, a girl named Shayna and a boy named Nathan. And on July 29th, 1996, it was Nathan's 2nd birthday, which was supposed to be a joyous day full of opening presents, overeating cake, and celebrating the young little tot's existence. But sadly, that's not how the day panned out. That morning at like 6:30, Vance left for work. When Piper woke up that morning, she started getting the kids ready and was about to drop them off at the babysitter's place when she was greeted by a surprise visitor, Duct Tape Man. Oh goody. At around 9:30 in the morning, Robert burst into the trailer and got into a brawl with Piper. The kids were still there, so they watched the whole fight go down. After the tiff, Robert snatched up Piper and took her away, leaving the kids behind in the trailer by themselves. And they were both super young, so I'm sure that had to be traumatizing AF. Don't get me wrong, it's a traumatizing situation no matter how old you are, but these kids were literally toddlers, so I'm sure they felt so helpless. At 3 in the afternoon, Piper's colleague Patty called the house because Piper hadn't shown up for work. Someone answered, and it was the 3-year-old little girl, Shayna. Shayna was clearly distraught because she sounded super panicked and was audibly crying. Patty asked Shayna if anyone was home, but the little girl said it was just her and Nathan. She also told the woman that she thought both of her parents had been snuffed. Patty was super freaked out, but before she could ask any more questions, Shayna just hung up. But moments later, Patty called again and Shayna answered. The little girl was bawling like crazy, saying she didn't want her parents to pass away. She then told Patty that her mom left with a man she knew in a black car. Patty then stayed on the phone with Shayna for 45 minutes while she got one of her other coworkers to call the cops. And at 5 p.m., officers arrived at the trailer. When the first officer opened the front door, he said the trailer was a mess. There were a bunch of random household items thrown all around the room, leading him to believe that a big struggle ensued. He walked through the trailer and made it to the back bedroom where he found Shayna and Nathan. Shayna was an emotional wreck, and Nathan was pretty quiet, but thankfully both kids didn't look like they'd been harmed. Detectives decided to prioritize talking to Shayna since Nathan wasn't much help. The kid just turned 2, so he probably had a small vocabulary at that point. During her tease session with the detective, Shayna described the perp as a mean man who drove a black car with black wheels. She said he came into the trailer, got in a fight with her mom that involved a lot of yelling, and the sound of a firearm went off. He also took Nathan's brand new blue tint that he just got as an early birthday present the night before. Okay, that is just plain cruel. After the detectives got Shayna to tell them everything she knew, their next move was to question nearby witnesses. Vance told officials that a few days before the incident, a young, chubby, bald man stopped by their trailer. The man apparently came over to ask about enrolling his kids in Vance and Piper's Bible camp. But at that point, the camp was over for the summer, so Vance told the guy to leave his name and number so they could follow up next year. The man then wrote down the name Rob Anderson, scribbled a phone number, and headed back to his Ford Bronco, which is the same type of car other witnesses reported seeing around the time of Piper's disappearance. Zinger! With the information that Vance gave investigators, they pinned 26-year-old Robert Leroy Anderson as their main suspect. That next day, officials got in touch with Robert and asked him to voluntarily come into the station to be interviewed, and he did. Over the course of an 8-hour interview, Robert admitted to stopping by the trailer a few days earlier. But instead of telling them the truth, he came up with the lie that he stopped by to ask the family if he could use their archery range on their property. He claimed no one was there when he knocked, so he left. Robert said he was not involved with Piper's abduction and said he knew nothing about her whereabouts. But the cops didn't buy that, so they secured a warrant to search Robert's house and car. And when investigators looked through Robert's Ford Bronco, they found receipts for duct tape, black paint, paintbrushes, and a bucket. The receipts were from July 29th, the day of the incident. What a coincidence. Something quite interesting about Robert's Ford Bronco is it was originally dark blue, but around the time of the crime, Robert had given it a terrible paint job with the black paint he bought at the store. And this wasn't the kind of paint that was meant for cars. It was literally tempera paint that you find at the Michael's craft store or something. The reason Robert got this kind of paint was so he could disguise his hot rod for the crime and then go home and wash off the paint hoping no one would suspect a thing. But Robert wasn't a pro car washer because there was a bunch of leftover paint on the vehicle that cops immediately clocked. When officials searched the interior of the vehicle, they found a wooden platform with holes drilled into it that were the perfect size for ankles and wrists. It was theorized that this contraption was used by Robert as a device to hold his victims down. And attached to the wooden platform were a few strands of hairs that were a match for Piper. Well, there you have it. As much as he tried to cover it up, the cops knew Sir Paints-A-Lot was the perp who took Piper. Some other sketchy things officials found in Robert's car include a dirty shovel, toolbox, furniture moving straps, weeds, and some dog fur that matched the family's Labrador Retriever. When cops searched Robert's home, they found a set of handcuff keys and a pair of red-stained jeans that were later tested for DNA. The liquid on the jeans were not Robert's, so they assumed they were Piper's. At this point, not all of the evidence collecting and testing had been performed, so the detectives let Robert go after their questioning sesh. That same day, Vance and Shayna were called to the station. Detectives showed them the pictures of 6 different men and asked the two to identify the man that had come to their house. But the picture they used for Robert was from an old driver's license, so he had super long hair and a mustache, making it impossible for the father and daughter to identify him. Wait, why didn't the cops just snap a quick pic of the dude when he was in the station that day? Who doesn't love a good photo op? Well, 2 days later, investigators called up Vance and Shayna again. They showed them a series of pictures, but this time they used a more current pic of Robert. And seconds later, Vance and Shayna both identified Robert as the man who came by their trailer. And that was enough evidence for detectives to press charges, so on August 2nd, cops arrested Robert on 2 counts of abduction. Investigators still didn't find Piper's body or gotten a solid confession, so they couldn't charge Robert for executing her. After Robert was arrested, the police conducted a huge hunt for Piper and any other evidence that might lead to more answers about the case. During the search, officials found half of the black and white striped shirt Piper was wearing on the day she disappeared. They also spotted a roll of duct tape with human hair attached to it, not too far from that. Later, the sample was analyzed against hair from Piper's brush, and they appeared to be a match. The duct tape also matched the roll recovered from Robert's car 2 months prior. Interesting. But that's not all. Around the same area the shirt and tape roll were discovered, searchers found a bunch of ropes and chains, bolts, a half-burned candle, and that was the moment the cops knew they were dealing with a sadist. We won't get into it too much, but after talking to some of Robert's friends and family, they found out the dude was into some pretty sick stuff. He had weird fantasies of going after women and harming them, and that's when Robert's buddy Glenn spilled the beans on Larissa, the woman who went missing years prior. But before Larissa, Robert and Glenn actually targeted another woman named Amy. They orchestrated the same setup as Larissa's attack, wheel poppers and all. And little Miss Amy wasn't as concerned as Larissa about pulling over to the side of the road by herself to change her tire. As soon as she checked out her flat tire, she walked around to the trunk of her car to grab her spare, and that's when Robert came up behind her, snatched her up, and took her down the road towards the woods. Somehow, Amy was able to break free and waved out a car to pick her up and flee from her attacker. Amy never came forward until years later when Piper's case came about. When I first found this out, I was like, girl, why didn't you go immediately to the cops and rat this guy out? But then I thought about how slow and sometimes twisted the court system can be for victims, so if a conviction wasn't able to be made in Amy's case, Robert could just strike at her again, maybe taking her out for good. So after Robert was in cuffs, I guess Amy felt confident enough to tell the cops about her run-in with the duct tape man. She was able to pick him out of a lineup, but Robert never stood trial for the attempted abduction. Glenn, Robert's sidekick, took the brunt of the fall for that case. He also told the cops that he was an accomplice in Larissa's initial abduction, but claimed he wasn't involved in the more gruesome acts that followed. To protect himself from a more serious conviction, Glenn agreed to show the cops where Larissa's body was dumped. In May 1997, Glenn led the cops to a shallow, unmarked grave near a lake. Officials dug up the site and found remnants of Larissa's skeleton. They also discovered pieces of Larissa's clothing, jewelry, and her shoes, as well as a pair of work gloves and bullet casings. So even though parts of Larissa's skeleton were found, there was a significant amount of her remains missing. The cops had no idea what happened. They first thought it could have been from animals, but there really weren't any signs of critters that had been scavenging in the area. Around the same time of all of this, the trial for Piper's abduction was going on. Robert was found guilty and received a life sentence. But the cops weren't done investigating the sick man's crimes. They continued to look for answers as to why part of Larissa's skeleton was missing and where Piper was. In August, Robert's cellmate Jeremy came to the police with some dirt on Roberts. Ooh, okay, so I'm glad he's going to the cops about the case, but I hope his cellmate didn't find out he ratted him out. You know what they say about snitches. So Jeremy said he shared a cell with Robert for a week, and the whole time he bragged about slaying Piper and Larissa. Jeremy told this all to the police and even told them Robert kept trophies of his victims at his grandma's house. His grandma's house? I knew this dude was demented, but dang. Once investigators found out about Robert's secret trophy stash, they went over to his grandma's house to check it out. I wonder if this woman knew her house was being used to store evidence. That had to be quite an interesting scene when the cops showed up at her house. Tucked between the ceiling and wall of Robert's grandma's basement was a ring and necklace that belonged to Piper and Larissa, as well as a firearm. In his interview with officials, Jeremy also said Robert told him he thought Glenn might go to the cops about Larissa's crime. And, I mean, he must have known Glenn pretty well because he got that part right. To prevent the cops from being able to identify Larissa, he decided to go back to the grave and remove her skull and teeth to get rid of them. It is believed that Robert threw the skull and teeth out of his car window as he drove away, but it's not confirmed with evidence. So what ended up happening to Robert? In March of 1999, he went to trial for slaying Larissa and Piper. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was given the ultimate sentence. The Supreme Court met to discuss Robert's appeal, but before they could reach a conclusion, Robert took his own life. 3 months before Robert's big ado, his father actually ended his own life. So most people believe that was the incident that prompted Robert to follow suit. Like father, like son. And after Robert's big exit, the Supreme Court of South Dakota dismissed his appeal, which marks the end of Robert's story. Now that Robert's gone, every woman in America can sleep a little bit easier knowing he's not setting up a flat tire trap for them or going after them with a roll of duct tape. Nah fam, I'll pass.